Hey, Larkin Rose here. It occurs to me that so many people watch TV shows and movies and hear things about the legal system and all the weird procedures you see in the court dramas and all that stuff. And they don't really know where that stuff came from. They don't, half the time, they don't know what it means. So I thought I would make a short series of videos in little chunks to explain some of the basic things about that most people probably don't know, even though they're not that complicated and they actually make sense. I'm titling this series, What is Justice? Because a lot of these things you see in TV dramas and things like that, they actually have a basis that makes a lot of sense. Smart people thinking up things that really are a way to make it more likely that justice occurs. Now, in the version we have now and the way government works now and the way justice works now, it's been corrupted and mangled and often works in the wrong direction. But we're going to get into that too. So I wanted to do a series of things that basically explain a lot of the things you'll hear about in the news and in TV shows and movies having to do with the legal system, but more specifically having to do with things that people have figured out over the centuries when it comes to providing justice. So imagine, I'm just going to do a quick little overview first. And throughout this video, you can go to the description below and it'll have tags for the little subparts of the video that talk about different issues, such as due process and presumption of innocence and rules of evidence and burden of proof and a bunch of other things. So you can go do it in pieces. There'll be little pieces each. I didn't want to make everyone its own video because they're going to be pretty short. But you can go through and see which pieces you're interested in or which pieces you may not know much about yet. And so, but I'm going to make this a simple summary. There's a lot to cover. You're not going to have a law degree when this is over or anything, but there'll be a bunch of stuff that you'll at least have a better understanding of where it came from and why we do that and how it's been corrupted and how justice isn't being served a lot of the time these days. So, and what do I mean by justice? I might as well start with that in this overview. Let's say there's something happened and somebody had their car stolen. It's an easy enough thing to imagine. Happens all the time. And people are trying to figure out, well, who did it? And somebody says, well, I think that guy did it. Well, I think this guy did it. Well, I think my neighbor did it. The idea of justice is about protecting the innocent, but it's about protecting the innocent in two ways. Protecting the innocent victim. Like if somebody was just minding their business and somebody stole their car, that's not okay. Justice tries to fix that as much as you can fix such a thing. And at the same time, protect the innocent by not accidentally punishing somebody who didn't actually do it. So if the guy says, well, I think it was my neighbor because I don't really like him and he doesn't really like me and I suspect he stole my car. And if everybody in the town gets all riled up and they like go beat the tar out of the neighbor and steal his money and stuff based on a guess that he did it and it turns out he didn't, well, that's also the injustice. That's also the innocent suffering needlessly. And so the purpose of justice is to protect the innocent, both the innocent victim of a crime and the innocent person who's suspected of committing the crime. So there's a lot of rules and things that you'll hear about on the TV and you think, well, why do those exist? Like if the person really is a thief or a murderer or stuff, why does he have all these rights? The purpose of those rights, and we'll get into the specifics, is not to protect the guy who actually did it. I mean, a couple of them are, like unusual punishment. If some kid steals a Snickers bar, you don't decapitate him. But most of the rights and things you see on TV about, you have the right to remain silent, you have a right to blah, 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 that isn't about protecting the guilty. It's about protecting the innocent. Trouble is, we don't know who that is. So if you start with a scenario where somebody's car is missing and they're accusing their neighbor of stealing it, and there you are thinking, well, did he do it or didn't he do it? The entire concept of actual justice is to try to get justice for the victim of the crime and to try to get justice for people who are accused of it who didn't actually do it. And it's, rational, moral people want to do both of those. They don't want to go, beat up the neighbor for stealing the car and then find out, oh, he didn't actually steal the car. We just guessed wrong and then beat him up. Well, yeah, now you're the victimizer. You thought he was, and now you are. And now somebody has to decide what to do with you. So this series of videos will cover a bunch of ideas that have evolved over the centuries, and they've been around for a long time, some of them, to make that not happen, to try to make justice happen as often as we possibly can. Doesn't mean we always know or have enough evidence to prove who actually did something or what to do about it. But these days, a lot of that you'll just hear legalese, gobbledygook, and see weird procedures you don't understand in like court drama TV shows. And if that stuff doesn't make any sense to you, this series may help out a bit by giving you a background of where these things came from. And again, showing how they've sort of been corrupted and derailed and used for a purpose other than actual justice. But so that's the overview. And now we'll get into some of the specific concepts that you'll hear talked about in the news and reports about crimes and in TV dramas and stuff, which are often very inaccurate, like what they show in courtrooms. They make it more exciting than would actually happen. We'll get into some of that too. So that's the overview. And the next segment will be about the concept of due process and what it means. Okay, so the first term we're going to cover is due process, which you may have heard. I'm sure you've heard it somewhere or other, and what it actually means. Now, the Fifth Amendment in the Constitution says people aren't supposed to be deprived of their liberty or property without due process of law. Now, I'm going to get into what the government pretends is due process, but I'm going to start with the concept that sort of predates the legal version we have today, the philosophical concept that isn't about, lawyers speaking in a language you don't understand. It's actually about normal human beings wanting to make sure that the innocent are protected as much as possible, both the victims and the falsely accused, or just falsely suspected. So the concept of due process is that we as human beings, we should have enough brain and intelligence that if somebody is suspected of wronging somebody else, of stealing their stuff, of assaulting them, of whatever, that we say, okay, we'll pause long enough to actually make sure we go through the process of finding out as best we can whether they actually did it. So we don't start with the punishment. We don't start with a hunch and then beat him up and then try to find out later if he actually did it. We go through what's called due process of law and go through the evidence and go through a lot of the issues that I'm going to be talking about later in this video series of what counts as evidence and what witnesses do you believe and how do you, as somebody who wasn't there, you're not the victim, you're not the perpetrator, you're just somebody else, how do you go about trying to find out what actually happened? And there's no guarantee you even can. But how do you at least try to go about going through a deliberate, thought out process to try to figure out what actually happened? Now, due process has acquired a different meaning, which is when government decides to write a law or impose a tax or a regulation or some requirement, and it isn't even about determining justice. You didn't wrong anybody. Government just decided, we're going to do this to you. And if we catch you like resisting or not going along with what we say, then we're going to punish you. And in that case, there may not actually be a victim. There may not be anything wrong that happened other than you disobeyed government, which government is going to say is wrong, even if it isn't. And then their version of due process is, well, we give you some ways to try to demonstrate that you really did obey us, even if obeying them wasn't the right thing to do. So they use the concept of due process to be about whether you obeyed the dictates of the politicians by way of law. But I'm going to talk about due process in the concept of actual justice, of if somebody really did harm somebody else and we're trying to figure out who did it. Somebody's suspected of doing it. We'll stick with the example of somebody wakes up and his car is gone in the morning and he suspects his neighbor who he doesn't really like, and the neighbor doesn't really like him, and he goes, I think he did it. And the rational, moral human being says, okay, we're not going to jump to any conclusions. We're not going to suddenly go attack him because you said you think he did it. We want to go through a process where we determine as best we can what the actual truth is, what the reality is. Now, if you're a third party, you're a spectator, basically, how do you know whether the person did it or not? How do you know what actually happened? Suppose the person with the missing car says, I know you did it. And the neighbor says, I did not. What are you talking about? Okay, now you have two sets of testimony. They're both saying two things. They don't match. One of them's wrong. Now, one of them might be lying, like the guy, maybe the neighbor really did steal the car and now he's pretending he didn't. But they also might just be mistaken. Like they may both be telling the truth as far as they know, but it turns out the neighbor didn't actually take the car. It's just the guy whose car was stolen thinks that he did and accuses him and really believes that he did that, even though he didn't. The concept of due process is never mind your emotions, never mind your hunches and guesses and suspicions. How do we actually prove what did or didn't happen? And what do we do if we can't prove it? Like, well, maybe he stole it, but is there actually evidence? And if you can't all the way prove it, which is better? To say, well, we're just going to come beat you up because we kind of think you did it, even though we can't prove it. Or we're going to not do anything to you and maybe let you get away with stealing a car. If you can't prove whether it happened or not, which of those is better? And the concept of due process basically says, if you can't prove it, then it's not okay to do anything to him. That it's better to let a guilty person go free rather than risk punishing an innocent person. And whether or not you agree with that, that's a concept that sort of evolved over time many, many centuries ago, where people figured out, imagine that you eventually find out that you punished an innocent person for something they didn't do. Like, that's a thing to be really, really careful of, just as much, as zealous as you are of protecting the victim, the guy who got his car stolen, the guy who got beat up, whatever, the victim of any crime, just as zealous as you are about protecting them, you also need to do the same thing to protect someone who is accused but didn't actually do it. And so the concept of due process is just, okay, we're going to have a bunch of steps that we go through to determine as best we can what actually happened and then what we're going to do about it. So actually, most of the other steps and points that this video series is going to cover actually fall under the concept of due process, because most of them are about, well, how do we go through a particular procedure to determine as best we can what is and what isn't true, and then what to do about it. So, because there is no perfect way to determine the truth. If you weren't there and didn't see it yourself, there's evidence. Now, some evidence can be really damning, like, okay, the car showed up in the neighbor's garage with his fingerprints all over it, next to a camcorder with a recording of him laughing about how he stole his neighbor's car. Okay, that's enough evidence that, yeah, he probably did it. That's pretty conclusive evidence. But sometimes the evidence is a lot lower than that. And then you get concepts of burden of proof and rules of evidence, what even counts as evidence and what testimony do you believe and things like that. But all of those tie into the concept of due process. So, but that's due process in a nutshell. And then the next concept will be presumption of innocence. So we'll cover that next. All right. So as I said, there are a whole bunch of different concepts that fall under the umbrella of due process, where we're trying to figure out what's true and what to do about it instead of just flying off the handle and going by hunches and suspicions and baseless accusations. Again, we'll use the example of a neighbor wakes up and his car is missing, and he immediately suspects the neighbor he doesn't like and says, I bet he took it. And the neighbor says, no, I didn't. What are you talking about? So now, what do we do about that? We as human beings, I don't mean run off to the police and courts. I'm talking about concepts that people have thought about for centuries, even just as people, without the involvement of legislators and all that. Just normal people thinking, well, how do we make sure justice happens as much as we possibly can? Because even if there's no cops and no government and no legislators, decent, rational people are still going to want to make sure that they don't punish the innocent, but that they also defend the victims of actual, crimes that hurt people, take their property and things like that. So one of the concepts that evolved over time is the presumption of innocence. And you'll see in a bunch of historical movies, this was not always the case. Very often it's like, well, somebody accused you of being a witch, so we're going to cage you and burn you at the stake and then find out whether you actually did anything. The presumption of innocence, by the way, this is often mischaracterized as you're innocent until proven guilty. No, you're not. You might be totally guilty. The question is not whether you're guilty or not. It's whether you're presumed innocent by everybody else. So if you actually did some crime but were careful enough to not leave any evidence, it doesn't mean you're not guilty. It does mean that other people have to assume that you're not guilty until they have evidence to prove that you are. And again, that's to protect the innocent who might be suspected of a crime or might be accused of a crime who didn't actually do it. So when people say you're innocent until proven guilty, they're completely wrong. If you're guilty, you're guilty, regardless of whether anybody else knows it or not, regardless of whether there's any evidence of it. The thing is, the other people who have to figure out what happened and decide what to do about it, they need to assume innocence until they can prove guilt. Because the alternative is the angry mob that hears some rumor about somebody doing something and runs out and beats somebody up or lynches somebody or trashes his house. And then they find out, oh, he didn't really do that. Like somebody with a grudge made up the accusation, or somebody was just mistaken and thought they saw him and they actually saw somebody who just looked like him, or somebody just completely made it up, whatever. The presumption of innocence, the concept of presumed innocent until proven guilty, is just about we're not going to do anything to the accused, the person who's suspected of committing this crime, until we actually prove that he did it. Because the alternative is people flying off the handle and harming other innocent people and making the problem way worse. So whoever actually committed the original crime, he's still out there. Nothing bad happened to him, but you made another bad thing happen to some other person who had nothing to do with it if you don't start with the presumption of innocence and say, okay, I don't know what happened, but if I start by assuming everybody's guilty until they prove that they're innocent, we're just going to be beating the tar out of each other right and left and shooting each other. Like if everybody just has the slightest hunch and then I'm going to shoot you because I kind of think maybe you stole my car. Well, okay, now you have victimizing that innocent and then somebody else going in the other direction and it's a catastrophe. Whereas if we're rational and moral, we start looking at every person as if, okay, maybe I suspect you did it. Maybe you really did do it. But until I have proof, until I have enough evidence to show that you did it, I'm not going to retaliate against you for something you maybe didn't do. In which case it isn't retaliation. It's just attacking somebody because you didn't know what's actually going on. And there are a lot of, you watch movies and stuff and there's, you as the viewer know that this person's this horrible serial killer, cannibal, whatever. You're watching the movie and the person watching the movie sees the crime happen. So you already know he's the bad guy. And if you see that and then you realize this concept comes up called the presumption of innocence, and like the cops show up to get him, and you're like, yeah. And the cops are talking to each other, and they admit, well, we can't hold him. Like we can't charge him with anything. We don't have probable cause. And I'm going to get into the concept of probable cause later. But if they say we can't arrest him yet, and you're like, why not? He's the bad guy. Well, you know he's the bad guy because the movie showed you that. But they don't have enough evidence to arrest him. The fact that you know he's a bad guy because you're sitting in your chair watching a movie doesn't mean the other people in this fictional example have enough evidence to actually decide that. So if you're sitting there going, rah, 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 come on, just arrest him, you have to keep in mind that the entire purpose of the presumption of innocence is that the rest of us don't know. And if you don't know if somebody did something bad, you don't assume he's a serial killer and then cage him or put him to death or something, and then go to the trouble of finding out if he actually did it. So the presumption of innocence, when you see it in action, helping a bad person get away with something, it can be infuriating. It's like, well, why don't they just arrest him? They should just arrest him. Well, you're saying that from the position of, all-knowing movie viewer that was allowed to see what actually happened. But in the real world, that's not how it works. If you don't really know what happened and you're just guessing, like imagine the tables turned when somebody points a finger at you and says, yep, that's the person who stole my car. And you're like, what? No, I didn't. I don't even know you. Now, would you rather have the rest of the world go, well, I don't know, you're suspected, so we're throwing you in cage. And you can't, how are you supposed to defend yourself? You don't know anything about the case. How are you supposed to prove your own innocence? And that's one of the reasons for the presumption of innocence is it's impossible to prove a negative. For example, prove to me that you didn't steal your neighbor's car yesterday. How would you do that? I mean, if he still has his car, that makes it kind of easy. But if a car goes missing, trying to prove a negative, proving you didn't do something, is often impossible. Now, sometimes you can say, well, I was in another state and I have a bunch of witnesses. But if you imagine yourself on the receiving end of a false accusation and you don't have a way to prove your innocence, imagine how unfair that would be if somebody's saying, we're going to throw you in prison for 20 years for stealing his car, unless you can prove that you didn't. And you're like, I didn't. I don't even know what you're talking about. So the concept of presumption of innocence is to try to make that not happen. And yes, sometimes the result of that is that somebody actually guilty will get away with something if there isn't evidence that they did it. But, a bunch of people over the years and centuries decided that's actually a lesser evil than accidentally punishing a bunch of innocent people because we thought they did something and it turns out they didn't. So that's the concept of presumption of innocence. But how long do you presume that? How much evidence does there need to be before you stop presuming somebody is innocent? Like a hunch, somebody making a guess? And that is where a whole bunch of concepts came up, which I'm going to address in the next part, that kind of fall under the concept of rules of evidence, what does and doesn't count as evidence. But we'll cover that in the next one. Okay, so if you've watched crime shows and court dramas and all that on TV, you've probably seen mentions of, they may not have called it rules of evidence on the show, but that's really what it is, where they're arguing about whether something is admissible or not. And that means whether you can use it as evidence. For example, the courts in the U.S. have decided that if the cops barge into your house, they don't have a warrant, they don't have any reason to think you actually did it. They don't have the what's called probable cause. I'll talk more about that later. They barge into your house and then they find, a marijuana joint or something. Ha ha ha, look what we found. And they go to court and the judge says, yeah, but you're not allowed to do that without a search warrant. You, the police, yeah, it may be illegal where you are, or it may not. Let's say you're somewhere where it's illegal to possess marijuana. And the cops just barged in and found it and went, ha ha ha. And the court said, wait, why were you barging in? You're not allowed to just randomly barge into people's houses. You have to have a warrant. And we're going to cover warrants in a later part of this series too. And what the judge may do is say, you're not, despite the fact that you have the pot in your hand that you got from his house, you're not allowed to use that as evidence because you acquired it illegally, because you barged into his house without a warrant, and you, the police, broke the law. And so what we're going to do is make it so you can't use that evidence. So that's one thing you'll see in crime dramas where they're arguing about what evidence is admissible based on whether the cops broke the law or did things right or did a bunch of other things. Like chain of custody is the concept of once they have evidence, they have to keep really good track of, well, who's had their hands on it, who's had possession of this thing. They can't just sort of hand it around and have anybody falsify it and like, oh, we found a knife at his apartment and then we gave it off to somebody else to go put fake blood on it and bring it back. And like they have procedures that are supposed to stop them from doing that sort of thing. Doesn't mean they always do, but that's the theory anyway. But a lot of the rules of evidence aren't about whether the cops broke the law. It's about whether the supposed evidence really is evidence, whether it's trustworthy enough. And one example that you'll probably hear about when you watch TV shows is hearsay. So, some lawyer might be saying something and some witness is saying something and the other lawyer says, I object, hearsay. And most people watching may go, I don't know what just happened. And the judge says, upheld, sustained. Well, what does any of that mean? There are rules, and they get really intricate, and there's always like exceptions and stuff. But the hearsay rule is basically you saying that somebody else said something isn't good enough as evidence because you may have heard them wrong, or you may have made it up, or they may have been lying. And if if the person who actually said it isn't here to question, somebody else saying they heard it, in most cases, is not admissible as evidence. You can't use that in court because they don't think it's reliable enough. Because there are so many ways in which somebody can say, well, I heard him say this, and they're actually wrong. Either they're intentionally lying about what they heard, or they're not remembering it accurately, or they're not understanding it correctly because they heard a piece of it, not the other piece, and didn't realize what the person was talking about. And so the concept of hearsay is one of the most often used things when it comes to the rules of evidence of what you're actually allowed to introduce as evidence. Now, evidence is usually either physical stuff or testimony. Somebody saying something that they know. And in court, the only people allowed to testify, again, there are a couple exceptions, like expert witnesses who know nothing about the case, but happen to know about some particular field of study or science or something. Sometimes they're allowed to be called to explain something to the jury about, here's how this test works here, blah, 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 even though they don't know anything about the actual case at hand. But most of the time, they only allowed testimony from people who are actually witnesses to something relevant. And it doesn't have to be somebody who is a witness to the crime happening. It can be somebody who said, yeah, I heard a scream and then a yellow pickup truck drove by really fast. Well, did they see the crime happening? No, it happened like way over there. But they saw something that might be relevant. So that witness testimony is considered relevant evidence enough to include it. So you can bring in the person who saw it. What you can't do in most cases is bring in somebody who said, yeah, I was talking to my friend and my friend said that they heard a scream and saw a yellow truck drive away. And there's a few reasons for not allowing that. One is it's really unreliable. What exactly did he say? And are you remembering it right? And are you leaving out pieces? And remember the concept of presumption of innocence. If there's somebody who's accused who didn't actually do it and they say, wait, did he say it was yellow or did he say it was like light color? Did he actually say yellow? And the guy's, I don't know. So if you're not questioning the person who's actually a witness to it, you can't really test it. You can't cross-examine him, which is the other party being allowed to question the witnesses. And we'll get to that later, the concept of cross-examining and the right to confront one's accusers, which is really the same thing. But there are a lot of different rules of evidence of what you can and can't bring in. But like I said, evidence is almost always in the form of physical stuff or somebody's testimony about it. Now, these days, it can also be a recording of something. But there are even cases where, for example, in a lot of states, you're allowed to record a conversation with somebody else without them knowing about it, and it's admissible as evidence. Like if there's somebody who's, been threatening you and bullying you and stuff like that, and you hide a tape recorder on you and you go talk to them and they go, yeah, I'm going to beat you up just like I did last week. There are some states that say, yep, if you know you were recording it, it doesn't matter if he did, you can admit that as evidence. And there are some states, and I don't know what the difference is in different countries around the world, but even in the US, from state to state is different. In some states, it's like, no, if you didn't tell him you were recording, you can't admit that as evidence. And once again, when it comes to these rules, there can be an example in a situation in which you're like, how could you not allow that? It's the guy admitting that he beat him up on tape. How could you not allow that? And so there are very often cases where applying these rules to try to get justice results in a massive injustice. And another example, because I was talking about, cops getting evidence without a search warrant. Suppose they just barge into somebody's house. They don't have a warrant. They don't have probable cause. They don't have any legal justification. They barge into somebody's house and they literally find a dead body with a knife stuck in it. Well, there's kind of a big deal because they may very well screw up their case because you can't use that evidence because you barged in without a search warrant. The fact that it's a body with a knife in it, like that's about as damning as you can get, doesn't matter if they didn't do things right and it gets ruled as inadmissible, which means you can't admit it at trial. You can't use it as trial as evidence, even though it's literally the victim with a knife in him because you didn't do the right thing. Now, that's a case where I think in a civilized, rational, moral society, the thing to do is not go, well, I guess the murderer totally gets away with it, even though now we all know it. Because the fact that it came out and they all know it and everybody goes, look, here's the body, and maybe everybody saw it, doesn't mean it's admissible in court. So everybody may totally know that this guy is a murderer. He may even admit it. But if the cops didn't do it right, it may be dismissed. And that's one of the slimy things you see all the time in court dramas, is some slimy lawyer uses the rules to get obvious evidence of guilt dismissed to let nasty people go. And the reason there is that at all is because there are the rules that are trying to protect the innocent people. So, for example, in an actually moral, rational society, I think if somebody barged into somebody's house without their permission and found a dead body on the floor, the reasonable response is not, well, you didn't have his permission to go in, so we're going to pretend that didn't happen. And it would be, okay, that's really bad. We got to do something about the murderer. And by the way, we might have to do something about the fact that you barged into somebody's house without their permission, because that's bad too. The fact that you happen to stumble on evidence that he's a bad guy doesn't make it okay for you to barge into people's houses when you didn't have evidence ahead of that. So now there's two people that we have to figure out what to do about. There's the murderer, which is the worst crime, obviously, but there's the guy who just barges into people's houses without justification. That's bad too. We have to discourage that. But the way to discourage that in a rational, moral society, if you ask me, is not to let an obvious murderer go. It's to punish the person who did the other bad thing. So the equivalent would be if some cop barges in and finds a body with a knife in it, you don't just pretend that didn't happen, but the cop has to be in trouble too, like a lot of trouble. Not a slap on the wrist, not paid leave for 2 weeks, but a lot of trouble for doing something really, really bad. The fact that it turned out that you did something bad to somebody who's even worse doesn't make it okay. Again, that's the concept of presumption of innocence. You don't get to go on a hunch, and which you see it depicted. I don't know if the writers are just ignorant or if they like the idea, but you see it depicted all the time in movies and TV shows and crime dramas where they have the flimsiest suspicion of, oh, well, he lived next to this guy 15 years ago and they have a similar last name. Let's go get a warrant and kick down his door and point guns at people. It's like, that's not enough reason to do that. And even if you find evidence that they did something really, really bad after the fact, that didn't make it okay to do what you did. And so again, that ties into the concept of rules of evidence, of things that courts will and won't allow, which does not match what I think an actually rational moral society would and wouldn't accept as evidence. Because there are a lot of times where, you know, the lawyers play their games and then the judge says the jury isn't allowed to see this evidence, whether it's damning evidence or exculpatory evidence. In other words, evidence that shows the guy didn't do it, because they argue about that too. And the lawyers will say, wait, why are you trying to suppress evidence that totally shows that the accused didn't do it? Well, because this and that and the other thing. And, you know, the lawyers will play lawyer games. But a lot of what actually happens in court, you don't see on TV because it's kind of boring. It's people filing motions back and forth, a thing called the motion in limine. I think I'm pronouncing that right, where the two sides argue back and forth about what's even going to be allowed at trial, if a trial happens at all, what evidence is admissible. And it's really dang boring, so you don't usually see much of that in TV shows. Usually you see a misrepresentation, but it's all about arguing over what actually counts as reliable evidence. Now, in some cases, evidence will be admissible even though you're not really sure. Like it's a witness. Let's say there's a witness for the cops, but he's also been busted a bunch of times and he's testified a lot of times for the cops, and you know the cops have dirt on him. So you're like, is that a reliable witness, or are they just getting him to say stuff to help their case because they don't have any real evidence? And sometimes a judge or a court will say, okay, we're going to allow this, but we're going to tell the jury, you get to decide whether you trust this guy, whether you think his testimony. It isn't, you have to believe everything he says because he passed our rules of evidence test. It's now you get to hear it, but you get to decide whether you think it means anything, whether you think he's trustworthy, whether you think he's telling the truth, whether you think he forgot things or is making things up or anything like that. But the concept of proof in science and mathematics, proof is a very specific, solid thing. It means you logically rule out any other possibility. When it comes to somebody being accused of a crime, that usually isn't possible. Every once in a while, something's really dang obvious, but still to prove it beyond any doubt is almost impossible, because somebody can imagine, like, okay, the guy's car was missing. The next day, it showed up in the neighbor's garage with a video recording of the neighbor joking about it. That seems pretty likely to prove it. What if the neighbor then says, well, no, my friend brought it over here. I thought it was his car, and we were making sort of a skit movie of me pretending to be a robber. I didn't really steal it. Now, you may think, oh, well, that's really unlikely. And maybe it is really unlikely, but it isn't completely impossible. And so trying to prove somebody guilty beyond any doubt is sometimes just impossible. And so the standard, and if you say, well, if you can come up with any weird explanation for how this might have happened and you didn't do it, then we're going to let you go. Then basically everybody will get away with everything all the time. So in this country, there's the concept of presumption of innocence until proven guilty beyond a reasonable doubt. In other words, yeah, you can make up some really bizarre concept that maybe this really unlikely thing happened and you weren't really guilty, but that's really freaking unlikely, so we all think you did it based on the evidence. And that starts to come down to a subjective judgment. Well, who's deciding what's reasonable? Like how reasonable a doubt? Like maybe the guy was actually framed for it. At what point do you say, oh, come on, your attempt to explain away all this evidence is just, talk about a reach. Like we just don't believe you. So there's always going to be someone who has to sort of draw the line of saying, well, what counts as a reasonable doubt? If we have all this evidence that seems to indicate that you did it, but there's some really weird, bizarre theory that maybe all this evidence existed, but you didn't, at what point do we say, well, we can't all the way prove it, so we're not going to do anything to you? And at what point do we say, that's close enough to proof beyond any doubt? It's proof beyond any reasonable doubt. Like it's ridiculous to pretend that you might not have done this based on this weird, wacky theory. And people, at the end of the day, people have to decide what they're going to accept. And that's the thing is all these rules of evidence, they sort of turn into some formal technical legalese game when the actual useful concept is for people to individually understand and grasp the idea that we really want to make sure that we don't punish somebody based on evidence that was completely unreliable and turned out to not be evidence at all. It was somebody saying something about somebody else saying their hunch about something or other. It's like, well, that's not reliable enough to like decide that he really did it. And so the rules of evidence now are this big, weird, convoluted technical game that happens between lawyers playing court games. But in a rational moral society, there would still be the concept of rules of evidence, just normal people, again, trying to make sure they don't punish innocent people while trying to protect the victims of actual crimes, going through the process in their head of, all right, what can we believe? What can we rely on? What's the difference between somebody said that somebody had a hunch and, well, here's solid physical evidence that actually links that person to this crime. And so normal people should be thinking of those things, again, always with the goal of justice, which is protecting the innocent victim of the crime and the innocent person who is suspected or accused of having done it when he didn't. So that's the entire purpose of rules of evidence. And the version we have now, the government version, can be just a convoluted, weird technical mess of lawyers playing games to see what they can keep in or out of trial, having nothing to do with what's true or what's just. But that's the system we have now. So in the next part, I will get into the concept of burden of proof.